really not homeless. Thank you, and thank you for your patience in hanging out to the end. The thought comes to mind: longer than a night in jail. I really want to thank David and Cecilia. I spent some time with Cecilia. She picked me up at the airport today, and there are no air traffic controllers in this country that have anything on what she was doing on the phone and in the car today. There was some talk about the justice system not working. One of my thoughts is that in some ways it works really too well. I mean, we are using it increasingly in this country to solve our social problems. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Just a thought. On June 26, 2006, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case entitled Kansas versus Marsh. It upheld a portion of the Kansas capital punishment law that said that in the event a jury finds the aggravating factors and the mitigating factors to be equal, then the punishment is death. So basically, tie means you die. The decision was particularly remarkable to me that day, not because of the majority decision, but because of a concurrence written by Justice Scalia. Now, in what one writer has called a particularly callous piece of writing, Justice Scalia took aim at the dissenting justices who expressed concern about the accuracy and reliability of the death penalty system in America. He concluded there had not been a single case of erroneous execution. He said, "It should be noted that the dissent does not discuss a single case, not one, in which it is clear that a person was executed for a crime he did not commit. If such an event had occurred in recent years, we would not have to hunt for it. The innocent's name would be shouted from the rooftops by the abolition lobby." Now, I remember exactly where I was when I read that opinion because I was sitting at my desk at the Chicago Tribune and I was putting the final edits to the third and final installment of a series that documented the 1989 execution of an innocent man in Corpus Christi, Texas, Carlos DeLuna. The lead of the story read like this: "It was a secret they all shared. Some kept it out of fear, some because no one ever asked. Whatever the reasons, it was a secret that might have saved Carlos DeLuna from the execution chamber. 23 years after Wanda Lopez was murdered in the gas station where she worked, family members and acquaintances of another man, Carlos Hernandez, have broken their silence to support what DeLuna had long asserted. Hernandez, a violent felon, killed Lopez in 1983. Now, I'll give Justice Scalia the benefit of the doubt about the DeLuna case. Our series began just one day before his opinion was published, but that case was hardly the first wrongful execution to be reported in the media. In 2000, 6 years earlier, the Tribune, in a series entitled Executions in America, presented 4 cases, one in Louisiana, one in Arkansas, and 2 in Florida, where evidence strongly suggested innocent people had been executed. In 2005, an investigation by the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund uncovered evidence that Larry Griffin had been wrongly executed in Missouri. That same year, the San Antonio Express-News detailed the wrongful execution of Reuben Cantu. And then a year earlier, in 2004, as David mentioned, reporter Steve Mills and I broke the story of the wrongful execution of Cameron Todd Willingham in Texas. We came to investigate the Willingham case because we had published a series of articles on forensic science, bad science, hair analysis, bite marks, lip prints, ear prints. We found a case of someone who was convicted in the state of Washington where they found a print something on a door to a bedroom where the victim was found, and they determined that the killer had actually leaned his ear up against the door to listen to see if the person were awake before they went in. He went in, and then they actually got some guy from Holland who had made a career of collecting ear prints. It's true, to testify that the mark on the door was the same as the ear of the defendant, to the exclusion of all other ears in the world. Anyway, I digress. One of the articles focused on arson and how the science was basically being ignored at the cost of wrongful convictions. And these weren't cases where they got the wrong person. These were cases where there wasn't even a crime committed. It was an accident, and somebody was being convicted of something that wasn't a crime. And after our series was published, we began wondering if anyone had ever been executed for an arson. So we looked through all the executions to date. At that point, it was around 950 in America, and we found just one, Willingham. He had been executed just 8 months earlier, in February of 2004. So we went to Texas and we took the case apart. We had we got all the evidence in the case, including the videotape of the fire department that did the walkthrough of the place. And we submitted all the evidence to 3 different arson experts, one of which was a prosecution-oriented who only testified for the prosecution, and all 3 concluded that he had been convicted on junk science. It wasn't an arson. It was an accident, and they killed him. So now, back to the DeLuna case. So this was in the late 2004, and by 2005, we'd been investigating criminal justice issues for about 6 or 7 years. Our investigations of the flaws in the Illinois death penalty had prompted a moratorium on executions in that state, and our series on false and coerced confessions had led to legislation requiring videotaping of interrogations in homicide cases. I mean, not videotaping of the confession, but of the interrogation. We had a case where they videotaped the confession of a 17-year-old kid admitting that he killed his mother, and then 8 months later, DNA proved that he didn't. So videotaping the interrogation is the key. It's not the videotaping of the confession that matters. So in the summer of 2005, Jim Liebman, a professor at Columbia University School of Law, contacted us. And this was a guy who's been involved in a lot of death penalty stuff. He had done studies of death penalty cases across the country that showed high rates of reversal. And he said that he had gotten a small grant from the NAACP to fund some research into trying to find maybe the cases of people who were killed who were innocent. And he had hired they'd gone through, sort of like Willie Sutton was asked once, why do you rob banks? He says, well, that's where the money is. So, of course, where did he go? He went to Texas. He had hired an investigator to look at this case of this guy DeLuna, and he had spent a little time, and he talked to someone who said, Carlos DeLuna or Carlos Hernandez told me that he was the real killer. So he knew what we had done in Texas on the Willingham case, and he called and said, would you guys be interested in looking at this case? He basically said, based on what we've found out on this one interview, this may not be an educational enterprise anymore. So we said, well, we can't make you any promises, but we're happy to. We get people call us all the time. We get defense attorneys and family members and inmates and telling us, well, look at this case and look at that case. And the first time you write about a case, the typewriters start humming in the prisons, And you sort of have to filter through these and figure out, which ones are legit and which ones are people that are delusional. And we were fortunate in this case because they had, and you get various degrees of information from people, and sometimes inmates have their whole file, and the transcripts and everything, and sometimes they have nothing, 2 news clippings. But the law students at Columbia had assembled the whole case. They had the transcripts, they had all the exhibits, they had sent somebody down, and they had gotten the entire file and copied it, and they sent it to us. So before we're going to get on a plane, what do? Well, our practice was we read the entire file and we read it twice. First time you read it just to read it, and the second time you read it and then you take notes, because the first time through you don't know how to discriminate between what's important and what's not. And so what was this case about? Well, February 1983, Wanda Lopez was stabbed to death in a gas station on South Padre Island Drive in Corpus Christi. It was notable because she was on the telephone with police saying that a man with a knife was in the store. Now, she had already called once before, saying that a customer had come in and said that a man was loitering outside with a knife. And they said, well, there's nothing we can do. If he comes inside, let us know. They actually suppressed that tape. That tape was not released until a long, long time later, because it was pretty embarrassing. So now she's on the call with 911, and she's trying to describe this guy in her hushed voice who's standing in front of her. And the guy's saying, well, is he white? No. Is he black? No. Is he Hispanic? Uh-huh. And suddenly she just screams. The phone, you hear the phone drop to the floor, and it's over in a matter of seconds. The blood trail, as well as the account of a witness who was outside getting ready to pump gas, tells the story. He scaled the counter. She gets stabbed. There's a struggle, and he tried to drag her by her hair into a back room. The man outside who watched this, who was waiting to pump gas, comes to the doorway, and the killer comes to the door and says, back off. I got a gun. And so, what do? This was a military man, and he locked eyes with him, and the guy takes off. Out comes Wanda Lopez. Her life is just draining out, and she dies right there on the pavement. Police converge on the area, and 45 minutes later, Carlos DeLuna is found shirtless and shoeless, hiding, well, yeah, he's hiding. He's hiding under a pickup truck about 3 blocks away. So they take him to the station, and the guy who was ready to pump gas, who came face to face with the killer, they pull up, and Carlos DeLuna is in the back of the squad car in handcuffs, and they shine the light on Carlos so that he can't see who's looking at him, and he says, yeah, that's the guy. Day later, his shirt and his shoes were found in a backyard close to where he was found under the truck. The shirt, the shoes, his pants, swabs of his torso, his arms, his chest, negative for the presence of blood. That's what hooked me. When I saw the crime scene photos, how could a crime that was so bloody inside the station be committed by someone who had not a speck? And you know that if they could find it, they would have found it. I guess they get some points for not making it up, but... So we went to Corpus Christi several times and began tracking down people who knew him, the police officers who investigated the crime, and most significantly, the people who knew Carlos Hernandez, a man who had an uncanny resemblance to DeLuna and had a violent record of stabbing women. We found 5 people who said Hernandez had told them he stabbed Lopez, and that DeLuna, whom he called his stupid Decayo, namesake, went to death row in his place. They told us he admitted killing another woman 4 years earlier, a crime for which he was indicted but never tried. One of the women, as a journalist, I spent a lot of time as a journalist, more than 30 years, and you never know what you're going to get. And we're talking to this woman, and she didn't really want to talk to us because she was undocumented. And she'd been in the States for about, 20 years, but she was undocumented. And she didn't really want to talk to us, but we had been told that this was a woman who Hernandez had stabbed. And we finally sort of inveigled our way into her house, and she talked to us, and then when she pulled up her shirt and showed us a scar that went from stem to sternum to belly button and described how he stabbed her. I mean, it was, you never know with the powerful moments you're going to get as a journalist. We found the gas station employee who was called in to clean up the station. It was actually opened 2 hours after the crime for business. And he told us he had conducted an audit and couldn't determine if any money was taken, and then we were able to get out of the court records the actual station records from that day, and he explained to us how every hour the rule of the employee was to, once you got $100, you dropped it in the safe, and that she had done that just before the robbery occurred. Well, the testimony at trial was from a corporate person who said that X amount of dollars, according to their audit, had been taken from the station, and guess what? It matched the amount of money that was in Carlos DeLuna's pocket. But it was also the amount that equaled his check that he had cashed that afternoon. No money was taken. DeLuna was assigned a lawyer who had never handled a criminal trial. Not a single mitigating witness was called in the sentencing phase. Just before, he told, well, let me back up 1 second. When DeLuna was arrested and he was identified and he was on the way to the station, he said, "I know who did it. If you help me, I'll help you." And they didn't believe him. So now we get to just before the trial, and he tells his lawyer that Carlos Hernandez, he was a feared guy in Corpus Christi, Carlos Hernandez. He said Carlos Hernandez was the guy who did that, but no one, not his lawyer, not the police, not the prosecutor, conducted any meaningful investigation into this. We determined, and actually one of the prosecutors admitted to us, that he knew that Carlos Hernandez was out there, but he sat silently in the closing argument at Carlos DeLuna's trial as his co-prosecutor said, "Carlos Hernandez is a phantom. He does not exist." We documented the violent past of Carlos Hernandez's other stabbings, one of which ultimately led him to be put in a Texas prison where he died in 1999. We talked to his mother, and her mother it's an amazing story. Her mother had, I don't know, 5 or 6 kids. She took out insurance, life insurance policies on all of them, and she collected on all but one. And when Carlos died, up in, she said, bury him up at Huntsville. She said she didn't want to pay for the freight to bring him home. We tracked down the guy who came face to face with the guy who comes out of the station. He's now living in Michigan. And he had saved all the clippings from the case. He was clearly disturbed by it. He dug out all the clippings and showed it to us. And we came in and we just said, "We just want to talk to you about this. What are your thoughts about this?" And he said, "I've always wondered about it." And he said, they brought him over in the back of the police car, and him being Hispanic and all, I just said it was him. So in July 1983, 5 months after the crime, DeLuna's convicted and sentenced to death. He's executed 6 years later, 1989. pretty quick, even for Texas. It was a sensational case in a small stage, so it didn't get national attention. Nobody really paid attention to this case. But in the end, it was a colossal failure of the justice system at every corner. I really can't, I'm skimming over it, but I've touched the high points. If you want to see a really comprehensive account, go to the Columbia University's Human Rights Law Review website, where Professor Liebman and students have published a book-length account that has you can click and get all the crime scene photos, all the transcripts, all the exhibits, video interviews that were conducted with all the players in this case. It's an amazing sort of online account of the execution of an innocent person. You can also track down a copy of a documentary called At the Death House Door. When we started to look into this case, one of the first things we wanted to do was to go to talk to the pastor of the guy who was the death house chaplain, and say, did he confess? Because if Carlos confesses, that's the end of the inquiry. I don't care how bad the crime scene photos look, whatever. If he says, Carlos told me I did it, then we're on to the next case. His name is Carol Pickett, and he actually presided over he counseled 95 people for the last 24 hours of their lives before they were executed in the state of Texas. And we went to see him, and we said, we want to talk to you about Carlos DeLuna. And he said, I've always had thoughts about Carlos DeLuna. And he revealed to us, for the first time, he had never told his family, his kids, anybody, that after every execution, he would come back to his house and go into the study and turn a tape recorder, and he would dictate. At that point, in time, Texas killed everybody at midnight. They don't do that anymore. And so he would come back, and it would be like 1 or 1:30 in the morning, and he would dictate. And he spent the last 24 hours with all these people. And it was a contemporaneous record of that period of time. And so he said, I'll play the tape for you. And in it, you hear him say how Carlos gets down on his knees, and he describes it in the cold, hard cell, and he asked me if we could pray, and he asked me if he could call me daddy, because he had never had a daddy. And I got to tell you, I just broke down and wept and listened to him. It was him describing this tape, and I realized, this is one of the most fragile moments, and he said he never confessed. He said, his last call was to a journalist to say, thank you for writing about me over the years. And she said, we found her in Louisiana, and she said, I said, Carlos, is there anything you want to tell me? And he said, no, they're killing me for something I didn't do. I listened to that tape, and I realized this is what it's like to kill an innocent person. So some people say, okay, that was 1989, it's a long time ago. System is better. It's improved. Except that you can easily find cases, Governor Brown notwithstanding, where defendants are sitting in death row across this country with the same kinds of wretched flaws that occurred in that case. Right now I work for the National Registry of Exonerations. It's a joint project of the University of Michigan Law School and Northwestern University Center on Wrongful Convictions. It's on the web. You can Google it. Just put in National Registry of Exonerations, and it has 927 cases of exoneration in this country since 1989, and we know we don't have them all, but it is the largest collection of exonerations ever assembled. It is a chronicle of more than 900 tragedies. In the report that was issued in May when it went public, it said the tragedies are not limited to the exonerated defendants themselves, or to their families and friends. It is, in most cases, they were convicted of vicious crimes in which other innocent victims were killed or brutalized. Many of the victims who survived were traumatized all over again years later when they learned that the criminal who had attacked them had not been caught and punished, after all, and that they themselves may have played a role in condemning an innocent person. In many cases, the real criminals went on to rape and kill other victims while the innocent defendants remained in prison. More than 100 of these 900 had been on death row. 10 of these exonerees were exonerated after they died. Many more left prison with disabling injuries or diseases. Some died within a year or two after their release, some by their own hand. Others returned to prison for new crimes. Almost all irretrievably lost large portions of their lives, their youth, their childhood of their children, the last years of their parents' lives, their careers, their marriages. These are the stories that should be shouted from the rooftops, to borrow a phrase from Justice Scalia. And that's where the media needs to play a larger role. We all know about the shrinking of media resources in this country, and yes, there's a certain fatigue that has settled over the issue of the criminal justice system, wrongful convictions. I recall a time when I went to see an editor and said, I got this story about someone who's been wrongfully convicted, and they said, well, we already did that story. I said, but it's another person. Now, you know, the Tribune's work has had an impact in Illinois and to some extent across the country. The death penalty was abolished last year in Illinois, and there's a huge group, not just the Tribune, a huge group of people who deserve a lot of credit. But I believe our reporting and our work there inspired a lot of other journalists to do this kind of work across the country, and I believe it helped legislators become educated, become emboldened to work for change, shift the debate to, can we trust the system to kill the right person? You don't see many legislators getting up saying, yeah, let's kill the wrong person. One solution, there is a solution that has not really been explored in a sustained, meaningful manner, and it can't be legislated, and it can't even come from the government. And that requires writers and editors, magazines, newspapers, radio stations, television stations, websites, books, to practice preventive journalism. Investigating wrongful convictions is not, as perceived by too many people, police, prosecutors, and judges, as an assault on soft, on crime, bleeding hearts. It's an attempt to serve law and order, to improve the administration of justice, and to foster faith in the criminal justice system. And so, you know, I want to commend the Vanguard for the work it's done alone just to shine a light on the criminal justice system. Seriously. I'm a great believer in sunshine and writing about process and putting things that happen out there for people to understand. And that's what David has done. As he said, I became aware of him, and he tipped us off to some cases we didn't know about. I've been very impressed. The media has to stay focused on the criminal justice system. Historically, the press has been skeptical, if not hostile, to claims of innocence. Coverage of crimes, including trials, has been marked by sensationalism and reports that are virtually lockstep with prosecutors and police. They get the right guy the most of the time, and thank goodness. That's great. But we still have to be vigilant. A few years ago, after we exposed a wrongful conviction in Illinois, I got a call from a woman who said, "Where were you when that case was on trial?" And she didn't mean me specifically, but she meant the newspaper, and I had to say, we were there, but you know what, we really weren't there. Journalists need to do a better job of covering the criminal justice system innocent people are depending upon it. You know, there comes a time in everybody's life where you sort of have to have an opinion on the death penalty. And that came for me in 1983 when one of my best friends from college, who had gone on to be a lawyer, was representing a woman in a divorce case in Chicago. And she was divorcing her husband, who was a Chicago police officer who was on disability and in a wheelchair. And at a routine status hearing, he stood up out of the wheelchair and pulled out a .45 and shot and killed the judge and shot and killed my friend. There were no metal detectors in 1983 in Cook County courtrooms, and that was the first time I experienced that kind of sudden loss of unexplained, like, why did this happen, life. But I realized in the weeks after that killing Hutchie Moore would not bring me any satisfaction. Hutchie Moore being the police officer. I realized that was when I developed my opinion on the death penalty. It doesn't do... Killing people to deter others from killing people doesn't work. Killing people to give people satisfaction, if you wait a lifetime, a generation, 25 years, I don't get it. And so, I'll close with this. Frederick Douglass, in an address 150 years ago about fighting slavery, said something I think applies to the struggle against the death penalty. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue until they are resisted with either words or blows or both. The limits of tyrants are proscribed by the endurance of those whom they would oppress. Thank you very much.